So we are in the middle of this series that Ashley and I started a while back. I guess I don't know, like a month or so ago, called "Deliver Us from Nowhere." And so what we've been doing is we've been sort of crowdsourcing prompts and asking questions about, like, what are some things that you were handed as maybe growing up, or maybe when you first were introduced to sort of an environment of faith, and certain things began to kind of come up in conversation. And there was this sort of part of your brain that thought, like, wait a minute, is that, like, do we really think that way? Do we really talk that way? Is this really something that we're passing on from generation to generation? And so we just asked everybody, like, what are some things that you would like to hear us talk about in the vein of those types of conversations? And so people submitted answers through the app or through email, and we compiled them all, and we're doing a series based on basically the questions that we got the most. And Ashley sort of this one that we're doing today is sort of the second part of a two-part conversation, because there were lots of questions dealing with ideas about heaven and hell. And so when Ashley and I first started talking about how to divide up the series, it became pretty clear, like, oh, we're going to need to spend 1 week on each of these, because these are actually two pretty big sort of topics to cover. And so in sort of trying to figure out how do we divide the topics, we decided, like, well, one of us is going to have to talk about heaven and the other one's going to have to talk about hell. And we decided that it would be the most on brand for her to talk about heaven and for me to talk about hell. So we're here fulfilling all the stereotypes that you've assigned to us already. And so we're going to continue that particular conversation. So again, there were a few questions dealing with ideas of heaven and hell, and things about, like, what happens when you die, and just all the things that would generally come up when you talk about questions like this. So we probably, a lot of us grew up in like various numbers of different traditions, and perhaps we were handed different images or ideas or assumptions about what these ideas sort of looked like. There are lots of traditional ideas and images in, I'm sorry. So the question sort of revolves around, like, these traditional images and these traditional ideas that we have about heaven and hell. How many of them are actually in the Bible, and how many of them were sort of adopted and developed after the Bible sort of was done, and then people began to explore these ideas a little bit more. And again, today we're talking about hell, which is like the least fun thing to talk about. And I want to start by saying, I'm going to skip to the end and just kind of give you the answer first. The best way to avoid going to hell is to pick up your phone and dial the 800 number on your screen. 1-800-TURN-OR-BURN, and leave a large donate, like the largest possible donation you can muster. Otherwise, there's nothing I can do. So, all right, so let's move away from that. And so, but seriously, so the idea of and images of hell have been, I mean, let's be honest, a pretty effective marketing tool for the church for a very, very long time. And church leaders have spent a lot of time and energy telling people that they need to do any number of things, from pick up your phone and dial this number, or send an envelope with cash or whatever, and that will make them basically, like, do these things, and these things will make you holy, and that will help you avoid dying and going to the bad place instead of the good place. You can take the up elevator and not the down elevator. And probably lots of us growing up, depending on what tradition you came out of, you may have heard lots and lots of sermons that sort of revolved around these types of questions. This has been forever a pretty hot topic, no pun intended. And it is something that people get very, very sensitive about. In fact, there was a book that came out, I'm going to say like 14 or 15 years ago, by an author that I follow. And the book was called Love Wins. The writer was a guy named Rob Bell. Perhaps you heard about this. And I was working at a church. It was a more traditional church, and I read the book. I didn't endorse the book. I didn't say that the book was, I didn't tell other people, like, hey, you should read the book. All I did was tell somebody that I read the book. I got called in for a meeting for having read this book. And the idea, and the thing is, the book, and you're probably like, what in the world is in this book? Basically, what Rob Bell does in this book is he sort of goes through, like, here are all the different ways that we've explored ideas about heaven and hell, like, throughout history. It's a really fascinating read. But the thing is, another famous Christian writer, tweeted about, which is a thing that people did at one point, about the book. And the tweet was 3 words. It was "Farewell, Rob Bell," because he had gotten a press release about the book. He didn't read the book. He read the press release about the book and decided that, well, Rob Bell is talking nonsense about what happens when you die. And so I'm going to go ahead and cancel him back before cancel culture was a thing. And I am going to basically announce to everybody that you shouldn't read this book because Rob Bell is talking about things that we're not supposed to be talking about. And so I read the book, and again, got called into a meeting and was warned about, like, don't tell people that you read this book. And so again, this is a subject that people get really, really sensitive about really fast. And we could talk about all the different reasons why, like, people get really sensitive. I would argue, and this is a whole other can of worms, but basically, like, I would argue that there's a certain percentage of us that sort of need our traditional ideas about hell in order to sort of preserve everything else that we've decided that we really need to hold on to. And when I say traditional ideas, I'm talking about, like, when you imagine, like, lots and lots of fire and, like, figures in red pajamas poking people with pitchforks and things like that. Like, anytime you begin to sort of disrupt a lot of these ideas, which, by the way, are not necessarily always in the Bible, a lot of when we sort of picture images of hell, we tend to sort of the things that we imagine were created later were created by, like, Dante's Inferno, or even the Canterbury Tales or Paradise Lost. There's lots of literature that came after the Bible that created some of this imagery that now we assume is in the Bible, but then if you go looking, you realize, like, oh, it's actually not. And so one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to kind of break these ideas down a little bit. And this may end up being kind of a sacred cow for some of us, and I'm fully aware of that. And again, if this is the last time I preach, it was great hanging out with you guys for as long as I got to. So, but today, we are going to ask, where do we find hell in the Bible? Like, when the Bible talks about this subject, what does it say? Where does it say it? And what does it mean? And we're going to be as literal as possible. And specifically, we're going to deal with the actual word hell. So first of all, the word hell does not occur at all in what we refer to as the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures. If you do a full-blown word search in any reputable translation and just look for the word hell, you will not find a single usage of it at all in the entire Old Testament, which is the first 39 books of the Bible. And so you only begin to see this word pop up once you reach what we call the New Testament. And so it only ever occurs in the New Testament. So the New Testament is mostly written in Greek with a little bit of Aramaic as well. And there are 3 actual Greek words that are often translated as hell. So we're going to look at each of those words. So get excited for those of you who love to talk about Greek words. So the first of the 3 Greek words that are often translated as hell is the word Tartarus. So this word, Tartarus, only occurs one time in the entire Bible, and it shows up once in 2 Peter chapter 2. So this is a letter from a guy named Peter to a group of people, and he one time makes reference to this word. And this is a term specifically borrowed from Greek mythology. And it's specific because Greek mythology, by the way, is older than the New Testament, for those of you sort of like coming up with a timeline. So this is a term, again, that originates in Greek mythology, and it specifically deals with the discipline and punishment of otherworldly beings like angels. And so based on the context of what Peter is saying in the passage, it's very likely he's using metaphor to try and say what he's trying to say. And again, this word only shows up one time at all. Jesus never uses it. Paul never uses it. None of the other New Testament writers ever use it. So that's the first one. Again, and we could almost ignore this one entirely, again, because it only shows up once, and it's in a pretty obscure passage. So then the second word is one you probably heard more often. It's the word Hades. And this is also borrowed from Greek mythology, and it is used only a handful of times. It's used 4 times in the book of Revelation. It's used once in Acts, and Jesus uses the word 4 different times. Once in Matthew 11, which is paralleled in Luke 10. It's used in Matthew 16 when he refers to something like he makes reference to the gates of Hades. And then in Luke 16, in a parable that he tells, which is the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. So those are the only times you find the word Hades. Now, the word Hades does not mean, it does not conjure the images that we tend to assume when we talk about the word hell. So Hades is a translation, it's actually a translation of a Hebrew word. And the Hebrew word that it's a translation of is the word Sheol. And Sheol, which does show up in the Old Testament, does not mean hell. It means grave. or it means pit. So this is a reference to death itself. It's not a reference to like another like place you go where your consciousness is like tormented forever and ever. It just literally means like when you die, your body goes in the ground and that's where you are. And so in Hebrew, there simply was no coherent system of belief about the afterlife, which is hard for us to imagine now because it seems to be like one of our major preoccupations. But in the Jewish world that Jesus emerged out of, and again in the entire Old Testament, there isn't any sort of conversation about this because it just wasn't something. It was not part of. It was not a major part of the discussion. So Sheol is as close as we get, and it simply just refers to the grave. In fact, we had our small group this past Wednesday night, and we were talking about this subject matter, and one of the questions that came up was, so if you were to go to like a Jewish rabbi, like that predated Jesus, and ask this person a question about heaven and hell, what would they say? And the answer is like, they would say like, what are you even talking about? Like, these are not part of this is not part of like the dialogue. This is not part of the discourse in any sort of way. Again, the closest thing they had was like discussion of Sheol, which is just like the grave, which is the place where you go when you die. Now there is in Hebrew, there is a phrase called olam haba, which literally translates to eternal life or life eternal. And we tend to use this as language about like you'll go to heaven when you die or whatever. But in Hebrew context, olam haba was simply what it meant was you live your life and you walk through life like with God alongside you for as long as you're given. And then when you die, that journey continues in whatever trajectory it had already begun. So it's basically like you live and then you die and then you continue to sort of journey and travel along like the story that God is telling in whatever fashion that means. That's literally as much as you get in terms of like what happens after you die in the Hebrew consciousness. So again, Hades is just a reference to like, okay, you're dead. Your body, your physical self is in the grave. So then that leaves you with the third word, which is probably the most commonly used word, and it's definitely the most commonly used word to make reference to hell in the Bible. And so the third word is the word Gehenna. So Gehenna, again, this is the word that's most often used when we talk about hell. Like it's the word you'll see more often than any other in reference to this. So what's interesting about Gehenna is this is a reference to an actual physical place at the time in the first century. And it's a reference to a place called the Valley of Hinnom. So this is a drawing. This is when I'm particularly wishing we had no lines on our screens because I would imagine this would be a lot easier to see without that. So this is basically just a bird's eye view drawing of the city of Jerusalem. So if you're at all familiar with sort of the other stories of Jesus and how he moves through Jerusalem, the Temple Mount is where like this is the most sacred place in Jerusalem. This is where a lot of like the major action takes place in and around this part of this part of Jewish history. And so then you have the upper city, or what's referred to as Mount Zion. You have the lower city, the city of David. And so outside of that refers to sort of just right outside the city, like the boundaries of the city itself. And if you'll notice, there's a little spot down here on the southwest side called the Valley of Hinnom, or Gehenna, as it's often referred to. So this is when Jesus talks about Gehenna, he's not using some sort of abstract metaphorical language. He's talking about a place that everybody probably passed when they came to town. And so what is this place? There's also a photo. I tried to find like a good photo to sort of show you like how, because this became sort of a place that people would refer to as like not a nice place, not a very good place to be. And at the time it was the town dump. But now it's a really nice park. So the photo does not really convey like, oh, the depravity of that park bench right there. So this is what you see when you go there today. But in the first century, this was the town dump. This is where everybody would just take their trash. And so again, it's on the southwest side of the city of Jerusalem. It's in a valley. And so the next question, of course, becomes, okay, well, why did Gehenna become a synonym for hell? If it's just like this place right outside of town where people would just like dump their trash, why was Jesus using this word in the way that he was? And why do we now talk about it in terms of translating it as hell? So which raises the question, did anything previously happen in this place that made it especially bad in the collective imaginations of the people? I'm really glad you asked. That was a good question. So in the book of 2 Kings, which long predates Jesus, you have a story about a king named Josiah. And Josiah was in the middle of performing lots of reforms. He was basically Josiah. There's lots and lots of discussion about Josiah's reform, like this whole era in which Josiah like steps in as king and does everything he can to say, like, look, we've lost our way, and we need to do everything we can to recapture in our imaginations what it means to be the people of God. And so that was Josiah's kind of mission in life. And so in 2 Kings 23, verse 10, it says this: Josiah, desecrated Topheth, which was in the valley of Ben Hinnom, so no one could use it to sacrifice their son or daughter in the fire to Molech. Now, we've talked about this before. Molech was an ancient Mesopotamian god who, when people would worship Molech, one of the key practices of this, in fact, the teaching basically said, to be faithful to Molech, you have to be a faithful servant of Molech. A person will be expected to take their firstborn child, bring them to the altar of Molech, and I apologize for the violent imagery here, but basically, burn that child to death in service to Molech. And this was throughout the Hebrew scriptures. This is talked about as one of the most horrific practices that the people are urged to stop doing and to stay away from. So anytime you sort of see like to talk about sacrifice their son or daughter in the fire to Molech, when this was a practice in and around the city of Jerusalem, this is where they would do it. They would do it in the Valley of Hinnom. So the Valley of Hinnom, or Gehenna, was historically known as a place of child sacrifice. So things that happened in that place that had been the exact opposite of everything that God dreams for God's people. Like anytime you start to imagine, what does it look like for us to be the people that God wants us to be? Whatever was going on in the Valley of Hinnom, like that's as far away from it as you can imagine. So over time, this place continued to exist in the public consciousness as a memory, kind of a point of memory of this really, really dark, horrific part of their history. So no one wants to, because it has this stigma to it, nobody wants to do anything with it. Nobody's trying to make it into a very nice park at this point. So over time, people just begin to use the place as the town dump. And so if you're taking all your trash outside the city gates and you're taking it to the town dump and you need to reduce the amount of trash that you've left in the dump, what are you going to do with it? You're going to burn it. So over time, more and more people would use this place to burn their garbage. So, and there were writers that talk about how sometimes you would go down there and there would be like fires burnt, just like little pockets of fire burning all throughout the valley. And you would go down there and there would be dogs like searching for old, like discarded scraps of food. And sometimes the dogs would fight over the food and the writers would so the dogs like mouths would like bang up against each other. And the writers would literally refer to that as the sound of the gnashing of teeth. So, which is kind of, if you're familiar with some of like the language about hell, you know that is a term that is often used. Like in hell, there will be like the gnashing of teeth. Like, yeah, that is a specific reference to a thing that was going on in the town dump. So, for the people in Jerusalem who were listening to Jesus' teachings, Gehenna is right there. So when Jesus makes reference to Gehenna, they're not sitting there thinking like, oh no, how do I avoid going to Gehenna? They're like, oh, right. Like we were there this morning. You know what I mean? And so Gehenna in the public consciousness is a very real, very prescient thing. So this word is used once by the writer James, and we'll look at that in a bit. And then every other usage comes from Jesus. There are 11 different times that Jesus uses this, including parallel times. And it's probably worth noting, by the way, that Paul, who wrote most of what we now have as the New Testament, never uses any word. No, of all three of these words, never once get used by Paul. Paul never once mentions hell in any of its forms. So the only times you have it, specifically as referenced to Gehenna, it's almost always by Jesus and then once by James. So first, it's helpful to remember what Jesus said about heaven when he taught his followers to pray. And of course, like if you haven't gone back and listened to Ashley's sermon from last week, I want to encourage you to do that because she did a great job of kind of exploring that space and talking about like when Jesus talks about the idea of heaven, what are we talking about? So just one specific kind of callback to that real quick. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 9, Jesus is teaching his followers how to pray. And this is what he says. He says, "This then is how you should pray. Our Father in heaven," and heaven, in the public consciousness, heaven was, again, it wasn't like sort of this place that you like float off to when you die. Heaven was like a realm in which things are the way that God always intended them to be. So it says, "Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So Jesus' prayer here is that earth would look more and more like heaven. Like, so he's telling everybody, like, look, when you pray, my hope is that you are praying that this space would begin to look more and more like the space that God always dreamed that it could be. And that's when, so Jesus talks about bringing heaven into earth, your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. So when Jesus talks about hell, you can imagine that it's probably the opposite of that. So if we have the power to bring heaven into this place, then do we not also equally have some amount of power to bring hell into this place? So when Jesus talks about hell, what is he talking about? So take a look at Matthew chapter 5, verse 21. This is part of what we often refer to as the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus said, so we're going to look at literally every time Jesus talks about hell. So anytime you see the word Gehenna, we're going to look at it. So in Matthew 5, verse 21, it says, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.'" He's referring to the 10 Commandments. And then in verse 22, it says, "But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Anyone who says to a brother or sister, 'Raka,' is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be in danger of the fire of Gehenna," or hell. Which, by the way, I don't know about you, I grew up in a house where things were taken very literally. And so there were lots of words we were allowed to say in our house. Fool was not one of them. And it was because of this passage. Like, look, you can call your brother any name you can think of except this one, because this one you might actually go to hell for it. So we're going to leave that one off the table. So we're going to see that maybe that's not what Jesus is saying. It's not a like go straight to hell card that you pulled in Monopoly, or some sort of demented, twisted version of Monopoly. So what is Jesus talking about? So one of the things he says, anyone who says Raka, Raka is an ancient form. It's a word that denotes contempt. It's almost like an onomatopoeia. Like it's the sound you make before you spit. And so this is deep contempt in which this person is doing something dark to the very core of what it means to be human. It's the idea of when I look at another human being, I don't actually see another human being. I see someone that I hold in contempt, someone for whatever reason I have no regard for, no love in my heart for, no grace to give to. And so it becomes a person who isn't really even a person in my mind. And so Raka is a way of saying you are less than human. I have no respect or regard for you at all. And then fool, again, the word I was not allowed to say as a child, fool in the ancient mind was basically a way of talking about a person with no actual worth in society. In fact, if you go through like the wisdom literature, a lot of times in the writer of Proverbs will talk about like a fool does this or a fool is, and the fool is always like the worst possible, like it's you don't want to be categorized as the fool. And so again, these are terms that denote like whoever it is that I'm talking about, there is less humanity in my eyes for this person. So in this passage where Jesus talks about hell, for Jesus, hell centers around profound contempt for other human beings. And so when I look at another person and I fail to see a fully formed human being, and then I think about them or I treat them as if they have no value, I am, in Jesus, to borrow the words of Jesus, I am bringing some kind of hell into our reality. So seeing someone as someone that you hate and being able to see no redemptive human qualities, I have brought some amount of hell into this space. So that's one usage of hell. So then in Matthew 5, 27, just a few passages down, it says, in verse 27, it says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one body part or one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell." Which, by the way, anybody that you know who's like, I take every word of the Bible literally, congratulate them on having both of their eyes. So there's that. Okay, sorry. Usually people are like, oh, right. Anyway, so then in verse 30, it says, "And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into Gehenna." So again, what's he talking about? This passage deals not necessarily with hate, it deals with lust. He's basically talking about when you look at another person and you don't see a human being, you see an object. You see something for your consumption or something for your use. What has happened here? Oh, we've brought some kind of hell into this realm. and you have dehumanized this person in such a way that you brought a little bit more hell into the world than there was before. So then, if you jump a few chapters down in Matthew 10, verse 26, which, by the way, this passage is paralleled in Luke 12, which counts as one of the 11. So in Matthew 10, verse 26, it says, "So do not be afraid of them, for there is nothing concealed that will be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made, or not be made known. What I tell you in the dark, speak in the daylight. What is whispered in your ear, proclaim from the roofs. Do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both body and soul in Gehenna, or in hell." So Jesus is talking to his followers, by the way, and this is really important too. When Jesus is talking, he's not like out like meeting strangers and having this conversation. He's talking to the people who are already following him. And so he's talking to his followers, and he talks about them. Do not be afraid of them. Well, who's them? He's talking about people who have power. He's saying, like, yeah, there are people in this world who will always have more power than you. And he says, don't spend your whole life being afraid of that group of people. And afraid means like showing like over an undue amount of reverence for. Basically, like just doing whatever this person says or whatever this person expects you to do just because you have some amount of fear. So you have this God who has the power of life and death. And Jesus says, don't be afraid of people who seem at the moment to have way more power than you do. Have fear and respect for the one who has the power of life and death. And so he's talking sort of in these very like broad pictures of like, yeah, there are people here who seem to have lots and lots of power and will happily wield it against you. And then there is a God who has some sort of like oversight over all of that. And so he's basically drawing a contrast there. So then in Matthew 18, if you jump down a few more chapters, beginning in verse 1, again, Jesus is talking specifically to his followers. He says, at that time, the writer says, at that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? He called a little child to him and placed the child among them. And he said, truly, I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be thrown into the depths of the sea. So he says, there are some people who are experiencing some kind of rebirth. There are people who are awake for the very first time and are engaging the world in a way that brings more goodness and life into it. And they're engaging with what Jesus is doing and teaching. And there are people who are alive in ways that they never have been before. And then if someone else comes along and gets in the way of this beautiful trajectory, of this beautiful thing that's happening, and we're quoting Jesus here, if someone comes in and disrupts that journey, it's better that they're drowned, according to Jesus. And then if you keep going in verse 7, it says, woe to the world because of the things that cause people to stumble. Such things must come, but woe to the person through whom they come. If your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life maimed or crippled than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and to be thrown into eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes to be thrown into the fire of Gehenna, which is very reminiscent of what Jesus said a few chapters earlier. So here, hell or Gehenna is what happens when someone tries to get in the way of someone else encountering what Jesus is doing in the world. And again, he's talking to his followers. He's talking to people who are already trying to figure out what it looks like to participate in this kind of story. And specifically when someone uses religion, and so he kind of doubles back, and it's almost like he's saying, specifically when someone uses religious language or religious power and they try to corrupt or disrupt somebody else's journey, like that is some seriously dark stuff. And so he's saying, yeah, that brings a little bit of Gehenna into this space. And then in Matthew 23, Jesus is specifically talking to religious leaders. And this is a section known as the 7 woes. And it's basically all of this is Jesus talking to religious leaders and saying, like, look, you are missing it in so many ways. And one of the things he says here in Matthew 23, verse 13, Jesus says, woe to you, Teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites, you shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in the people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those who enter who are trying to. And then in verse 15, it says, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites, you travel over land and sea to win a single convert. And when you have succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are. So in other words, you're like converting people into your way of thinking, and you're making them mean. You're making them like you are making them worse just by like you are telling them like, yes, this is what it means to be a person who is faithful to God. And then you teach them how to do all of these like mean, hateful things and to be judgmental and self-righteous towards others. And Jesus is saying like, yeah, you're turning them into twice the child of hell that you are, twice the child of Gehenna, if you will. And then if you jump down to verse 33, he says, you snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to Gehenna or to hell? And so he says, you are supposed to be the spiritual leaders. You're the ones who are supposed to be trying to bring heaven crashing into earth. You're the ones who should be trying to make this place more beautiful and filled with grace and peace and life. But instead, you're getting in the way. You're actually making things harder. You're making it worse. And he says, and when you do that, you're taking other people and you're making them more a child of hell than you are. So now we've looked at all these passages. You have just seen, in addition to the parallels that we didn't have time to look at because they're basically the same, you've just seen every instance where Jesus talks about hell. So then and then we have to look at one more because there's James does use it once just to be thorough. So in James chapter 3, verse 6, this writer says this. He writes, the tongue is also a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by Gehenna or by hell. So James, and specifically he's talking about the words we use, the power of our tongue, the power of your words. So James seems to think that our words are powerful enough to bring some amount of heaven or some amount of hell into this reality, which I think any of us would probably think like, yeah, I know exactly what he's talking about. Has anyone ever said something to you or about you that was so hurtful and that it felt like those words actually sliced right into your soul? You know what I mean? Like somebody said something to you and you lived with those words for days, if not longer. And has anyone ever used their words to make you question your own self-worth? Have you ever said something and later realized, oh, I did some damage there. I actually did some actual real life harm when I said that. That's what James is talking about. Because yeah, when you speak to another person, you have the power to bring some amount of heaven into the world. You can make somebody's life a little bit better, or at least their day a little bit better. You also have the power to shatter a person with your words. And this is what James is talking about. Like, yeah, every time we speak to another person, we have the power to bring heaven into this realm, or we have the power to bring hell into this realm. So that's it. That was as thorough as we had time for a look at all of the different places where you see this word Gehenna, which is the word we most often see referred to as hell. So we've just done an in-depth and complete exploration of every usage of the word hell in the Bible. But again, because it doesn't show up at all in the Old Testament, which did save us some time. So now that we've done that, and we have like 2 minutes left or whatever, but we're gonna go a little longer than that. So let's explore some questions with the time that we've got left. So the first question is, what are these passages even about? So when the writers of the scriptures talk about hell, what are they even talking about? When Jesus talks about hell, what's he talking about? So we looked at one where it's about anger and it's about contempt. It's about seeing another person as not really a person. Or it's about lust. It's about dehumanizing a person for my own benefit in whatever way that sort of takes shape. It's about irrational fear of other people, of assuming that other people have more power than they do. It's about causing other people to struggle in life. One or two of these passages about hell is about like, am I doing anything that makes other people's lives more difficult? It's about causing pain. It's with our words or with our actions. Sometimes it's about hypocrisy. It's about using religion to do harm. All of these are ways that Jesus talks about like, yeah, this is what it looks like to bring hell crashing into this world. So that's what these passages tend to be about. The next question is, well, then who is Jesus talking to? But also conversely, who is Jesus not talking to? Because we often assume, well, Jesus must be going to non-believers and telling them, like, here's how you avoid going to hell when you die. But he's almost never, in fact, in any of these passages, he's never talking to what we would describe to as a group of non-believers. He's always either talking to his own followers or he's talking to religious authorities in general. And so he's talking to people who either already follow him or who want to follow him or who have some amount of power in the religious community. He is not talking to groups of people that we would sometimes refer to, again, as like non-believers or heathens or pagans or Gentiles or any, choose whatever word you like to go in that box. So he's talking to people who are already a part of this story. He's not warning people about, well, if you don't follow this way, something bad might happen. He's talking to people who are already on this journey. And so, which takes us to the next question, which is what is hell to Jesus? When Jesus talks about hell, what is he even talking about? Well, for Jesus, according to these passages that we looked at, which is all I have to go on, for Jesus, hell, Gehenna, represents a present reality. It is the town dump. It's that place you go to leave things you don't want to see again. It's where there's always all these little pockets of garbage fires burning. And so Jesus is basically saying, like, oh, this is about the way people are living right now. So Jesus, in these passages, is pleading with people to be who they were created to be. These people were called to show the world what God is like through grace and love and peace. They were created to be a light in the world, to make the world a better place. And Jesus is saying, what you are doing, sometimes what you are doing here does not show the world what God is like. You are actually, not only are you not bringing heaven into this world, you're bringing hell into it instead. So when Jesus talks about hell, he doesn't seem at all interested in what happens to people after they die. Not really. Instead, he wants to talk to people about who they're becoming here and now. Again, in ancient Jewish consciousness, the idea of like where you go when you die, that was a secondary conversation. That was not even top of mind for most Jewish thinkers and teachers at the time. It was always about what kind of world are we leaving behind? What kind of space are we creating here and now? So, you want to see hell on earth? Find some people who have contempt for each other. Take a look at people who have stopped talking about each other as if they were human. You want to see hell, find someone who only sees other people as objects for their own usage. If you want to see hell, find someone who lives with an ever-present sense of paranoia or fear of other people. If you want to see hell, find someone who's driven by grievance and anger and makes all of their choices based on who didn't do for them what they should have done. If you want to see hell, find someone who uses their power to make other people feel weak or small. That is what Jesus is talking about when he talks about hell. When he talks about Gehenna, he's not saying like one day, thousands of years from now, you might find yourself in this place. He's saying like, no, every day you make choices. And you can either bring heaven crashing into the earth, or you can just make the town dump a little bit bigger and bring that space into this space. When Jesus talks about hell, he's addressing a state of reality. He's saying you have been called to be a light in this world. So let's not get caught up in things that snuff out that light. Let's bring more light into the world. For Jesus, hell is about now. So what would it look like? What would it look like to find little pockets of hell in the world and bring heaven into those spaces? Who do you know who is suffering? And is there anything you can do to bring some amount of relief to that suffering? Because that's what it looks like to bring heaven crashing into hell. Do you know anybody who's lonely? Who maybe the thing they want the most is for somebody to just check in on them or to ask them, like, hey, do you want to go grab coffee? Sometimes that's all it takes to confront hell in its present forms. Do you know anybody who feels a profound sense of hopelessness? What does it look like to bring some amount of joy or hope into a person's life who has completely given up on the idea that those things should even be real? Oh, that's what it looks like to bring heaven crashing into earth and to confront hell in its present reality. Does Jesus want to save us from hell? Yes. But I would argue that Jesus' primary interest when Jesus talks about hell is in us being saved from participating in hell on earth here and now. And I'm sure there are those of us here who are like, okay, well, you sort of like went around the actual question, right? Because the question is like, yeah, but what about what happens when you die? What does Jesus say about that? You just saw every place where not only Jesus, everyone, everyone in the entire Bible talks about it in these terms. And so it's almost never about what happens later. What happens later, if you want to talk olam haba in terms of what the Jewish idea of it was like, yeah, you live this life, and then in death you just continue that same journey in whatever form that takes. That would have been the ancient Jewish way of answering it. But Jesus continues to confront it and say, like, yeah, whatever we're trying to participate in, that we're trying to get out of here and go to later, that starts right now, actually. So right now, our interest, Jesus's interest, is not like, okay, buy this insurance policy, so one day you can go to the preferable place. Jesus is like, okay, when we talk about that, what we're doing is we're taking our eye off of the thing that actually we can do now. And the thing that we can do now is we can bring heaven crashing into this space and confront hell in all of its present realities. So, can you think of a space in which you have witnessed hell on earth recently? I would imagine you can. And so the question becomes, like, well, how do we get out of here as fast as we can? And Jesus is saying, like, no, 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 you're missing the point. The point is, how do we bring heaven into this space as fast as we can? So what does it look like for me to participate in this? How do we find ourselves moving towards bringing heaven crashing into earth and confronting all of the places where hell already exists in this place and in this time? How do we go looking for Gehenna all around us, and how do we confront those and bring a little bit of grace and joy and love and peace into that space?